I'm glad all of us are here well enough to be together and to worship the Lord. Appreciate the good rain. We've needed some rain to refresh the earth, and that's been helpful. I was here Wednesday, but some of you weren't, and I'm just glad to be back among you. In our readings this morning, we are in Ezekiel 43 through Daniel 3. And we'll keep in mind that we have prophets, major and minor, relative to the length, not the importance, but the length of their prophecies. And then we have time periods designated, such as pre-exilic, before the captivity, pre-exile. And then the captivity prophets. And then the post-captivity, post-exilic prophets. And of those three categories, where would Ezekiel fit? Pre-captivity or post? Captivity, that's right. And so what we have are Ezekiel is on the river Kibar, Jeremiah is in Jerusalem, and Daniel is over in Babylon. And Ezekiel, whereas Jeremiah had prophesied you need to capitulate, give in to the Babylonians, and the temple as well as your houses will be spared. Ezekiel prophesies again, similarly, that the reason for your captivity is because of your sins. Immorality, idolatry, all injustices, those were common refrains all through the prophets. But in 43 on and following, 43, what do we have pictured here? The temple, measured.
Glory of the Lord filling it.
What was that, Lynn?
Glory of the Lord filling the temple.
Yes, good. And then in 44, people had, look at 44:9. Thus saith the Lord, no foreigner, uncircumcised in heart, uncircumcised in flesh, shall enter into my sanctuary. But the Levites that went far from me, when Israel went astray from me after their idols, they shall bear their iniquity. Yet they shall be ministers in my sanctuary. He pictures a time when there would be a return. But Ezekiel also pictures a time where the return would be actually a type of symbolic or symbolism of a return under the Messiah. And in 44, 45, and 46, there's a new worship in the new temple. And that's not really the return under consideration. It's a type of worship pictured in what?
The church.
In the church, right. And so in these chapters, that's what we have. Then in 47 and 8, there's a description of the new land. The temple was in the land, and the new land is highly figurative of the Lord, the Messianic kingdom. And then the apportionment of that in the last chapter, 48. The tribes are mentioned. And then gates in the last part of the chapter. All right, in the book of Daniel, we have the first three chapters. Daniel is where now? We mentioned a moment ago. He's in the city of Babylon. And his friends are there whose names were? All right. And in chapter 1, we'll do this fairly quickly, 1, 2, and 3. In chapter 1, Daniel shows his refusal to compromise. How? He did not eat of the king's dainties or the king's morsels, specifics that evidently would violate the dietary regulations of the Jewish law. And yet, during all that time, he went to the UAB, didn't he? The University of Babylon, at Babylon. And during that time, he was schooled in the ways primarily to be in the king's court. In the second chapter, we have one of the most fascinating visions that the Nebuchadnezzar has. It's none of his satraps, his advisors could interpret it. And then they remember that Daniel had the spirit of their God in him. And so Daniel comes and not only reminds the king of what he had dreamed, which he had forgotten, but also what the interpretation was. There was a great image of what? An idol. And the head was made out of gold, breast, arms of silver, legs of iron, and feet iron mixed with clay. And he said, in the interpretation, you, O king, are the head of gold. There's going to arise an inferior kingdom, chess and arms. That would be the kingdom following Babylon, which was Medo-Persians. And then there would be another kingdom that would be inferior, and yet it would spread out all over all the earth. That would be what?
Great.
The Grecian, the Alexandrian Empire, Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great. Short-lived though, and then following that, you'd have a time where that little city way over there in Greece that was rising in power would eventually, that would be what? Rome. And he said, during the days of those kings, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. And what does he speak? The church. All right, and then in chapter 3, by the way, we didn't even mention this, there are two basic divisions to Daniel. First 5 chapters deal with the time when Babylon is the world power, and then 6 and following when who is in power? The Persians, exactly right. So in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar sets up this image of gold, and with some help from his advisors, everybody should bow down to it. Who did not? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What happened to them? Because they disobeyed, they were thrown into the furnace of fire. And what happened to them? Right, and those who were close by saw not just the 3 men in the fire, but a fourth likened to the Son of Man. And most understand that would have been Jesus in his pre-incarnate state. And so they come out, and then we have in verse, well, what happened to the people who had kind of encouraged Nebuchadnezzar to do all that? Well, they were thrown in and burned up. And then verse 30 of chapter 3, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the presence, in the province of Babylon. All right, we'll stop there in our review. Hope you're enjoying it and helping, particularly that it's profitable. All right, we've been studying through the life of Jesus, as you know, and we've come to the trials of Jesus. Let me put this over here. And we spent a little time Wednesday night on Peter's triple denials. Brother Farron and Sister Sandra are sick and not with us. Brother Farron asked during class if I could put together what I had on PowerPoint on paper, on handouts. And I actually worked on that some. And during the time I was working on it, I actually thought I can do a better job on this. I doctored up some of the slides, and I could not actually get, this is hard to read even for me with my glasses on. And I thought I could do a better job maybe making something different from what, it's just sometimes difficult to make a PDF out of something like a copy of a book. And it comes out plain on the PowerPoint, but if I try to print it, it's not as plain, unless you make a big page out of it. And I'm going to do something different. And so if you're interested in that, I'll try to have some Wednesday night. But I'd like to go back. I did doctor up some of the, that's a nice word for saying revised. I revised some of the slides, and I wanted to go back with you through all of that. First of all, though, let's go back. The major portions of the life of Jesus, we have the years of preparation, 30, and then the beginning ministry begins with what event? His baptism, followed by the great Galilean ministry, then circled around that area, periods of retirement, and then he comes down for the closing ministry, and then the events of the last week. Last week, we won't go into detail, but we'll just skip on down to Thursday night. We have already on Thursday preparations for the Passover. Strife develops, the Passover, the washing of the disciples' feet, the prediction that one would betray, one would deny. The Lord's Supper is instituted, new commandment. Then they leave. They go out, and we have the long conversation in John chapters, you tell me, 14, 15, 16, and then the what in 17? The prayer in 17. Good. And then we have Jesus go into the garden, separates himself from the 11, takes Peter, James, and John on into the garden, and separates from them about a stone's throw. And then we have his prayer, how many times? 3 times. And then as he's talking with them, behold, those who are, going to take me, and then they're there. And then we have the events surrounding his arrest. And then he's taken first, remember the 2 major sections of the trial of Jesus, looking at here, 2 major sections with 2 phases and 3 sections in each phase. Jesus is taken to whom first? Annas, then to Caiaphas, and then Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. And then on my chart, I've got an arrow that looks like that for you. And then they take him to Pilate, and then Pilate doesn't want to have anything to do with him, so somebody was in the area. Herod. And then Herod couldn't find anything wrong with him, so sends him back to Pilate. And then Pilate reluctantly sentences Jesus to death, knowing that he was sentencing an innocent man. So that's where we are. Now, it's during that first section, the first phase, before Annas, Caiaphas, and a small caucus of the Sanhedrin. And then it's during those times that that Peter is denying the Lord that we've been talking about. And we put this chart up to show, for instance, before Annas, only John records that, and the others. We won't go through that. And you've seen that. And then in the second stage, now the third stage, we've gone over some of this, and I'm just going to kind of spot read a few things. John records only the first of 3 stages. Luke gives only the last. Matthew and Mark give the second stage fully, but the third only briefly. Peter's denials continue through, if they do continue through all 3 stages. And Luke states about an hour passed between the second and third. Then no one of the 4 could give each of the denials precisely at the time it occurred. Now, this is what we did. We kind of went over Wednesday night. Several of you weren't here. And this is some that I've revised since Wednesday night. Critics of the Bible's inspiration use this event as an illustration of supposed discrepancy. They assume that Peter had to answer only one way each time an accusation was made against him. And since the accounts differ, you can't trust the Bible. There are several problems with this assumption and a few principles of telling a story that we tell, and specifically the Bible story, that all of us need to remember. And this is a little bit different way I've organized the material. But first of all, it's a selection of information. And let me just blank this out for a second. When we think about reading through the Bible, again, I think all of us know this, but just a reminder that we're not reading every event that ever happened. We're reading a specialized history. I've made the point. I've used the illustration because I think it's a valid one. Of the 100 years of Abraham's life that's covered from the end of Genesis 11 until the time Abraham dies in Genesis 25. 100 years pass. And we have just a few events, really. If you think about chapter 14, the Battle of the Kings, Melchizedek, and Abraham meet, you think, well, why 2 or 3 verses are given over to that? And yet it has so much relevance in the New Testament. And when you put all of that together, you think, here is a specialized history, a specialized, inspired history of the telling of the story. So it's sufficient enough to bring us to faith in God and Christ, that everything they said was exactly how things work. So there's a selection of information. And I try to illustrate it like a journalist. A journalist has much information from which to draw about a particular story covered. He has to select what is needful from all of that. He might have reams of material, but he's going to boil it down to just a little. Answering basic questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how, those 6 major journalistic questions, those things are pertinent. And they used to, in English and other places where a good journalist would try to answer each of those 6 questions in the first paragraph of an article. And to just do it briefly, then the article would develop those 6 questions. So it was, or is and was, with the inspired Bible story and inspired writers. They did not include everything everyone said, including Jesus, Peter, and others. Many other signs did Jesus that are not recorded. And the things that Jesus did, if we were to write them all down, the world would not contain the books. And he spoke of the mighty works of God with many other words that Peter exhorted and testified, saying, save yourselves from this untoward or this perverted generation. And so as we often do, there it was a condensing or summarizing of the story. Not every detail of the story is stated in each gospel narrative. I think that's helpful. Now, the reason is I'm making all this point is because a lot of people will try to use this particular example, as I mentioned in the critic note here, to try to say, well, you can't trust the Bible. It just has all kinds of discrepancies. It has all kinds of contradictions in it. You just can't trust it. And they either willfully or in ignorance, they don't understand that the Bible, in one sense, though it's inspired in one sense, it communicates to us just like we communicate to others. Second thing, critics assume that only one accusation was made each time. However, the text indicates that there were several gathered around where Peter made his denials. It is also evident that at least in the second and third accusations, more than one person accused Peter of being with Jesus and being among his disciples. And that would account for more than one accusation made each time. And we'll see that in the harmony. Critics then assume, just as critics assume that only one accusation was made each time, then they also assume here that Peter had to answer only one way each time. And when he answered what would be considered a different way or an additional way from what he answered in a different account, that can be explained. In other words, Peter said more than what is recorded in only one account, which is what I believe happened. It's not an either or. Either he said this or he said that. Either Peter said this or he said that, but both. Or in this case, all 4 accounts. You have things that Peter said. The same principle is involved with the Sermon on the Mount. The phrase kingdom of heaven is used often in Matthew 5. Kingdom of God is mentioned in Luke's account. Is there really is there a practical difference for us from the kingdom of heaven versus the kingdom of God? There really isn't. God is the originator, and the place where God dwells is in heaven. So it's God's rule from heaven on earth. You put it all together. It's not 2 different kinds of kingdoms. And it makes perfect sense. It's not an either or. It's all together. As well as numerous other events in Jesus' life. Each account does not contradict, but complements, and with an E, the others, just as witnesses do in describing an event in a court of law. In fact, if witnesses use the same kind of language or phrases, a court is led to believe that each was coached as to what to say, and the reliability of there being a witness is questioned. So all 4 accounts were not intended to be verbatim. If so, there was no need for all 4 accounts, only one. I mean, that would seem ridiculous if you had 4 accounts and each said the same thing all through. That's not giving us anything we don't already know from one. Each, rather, gives a different perspective of the same event. All right, so here's the page, and I've tried to enlarge it a little bit. So what we find in John is Simon Peter followed Jesus, and another disciple that was John. John goes into the court of the high priest. Peter is outside the door. John goes back and gets Peter and brought Peter in. And the maid, therefore, that kept the door said to Peter, "Are you one of this man's disciples?" He said, "I am not." All right, here's our first denial. Now, not only was there the maid who was the keeper of the door, there were other people who were around her. That's significant to the story. Now then, servants and the officers were standing there, having made a fire of coals, for it was cold. And they were warming themselves, and Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. This is all during the first denial. I have a line drawn here that goes up through there to note where this first denial is. And all of the other information is complementary to it. One of the maids of the high priest, Mark's account says, in the court a maid came unto him, a certain maid. And so while there's a certain maid who challenges him about this, makes the accusation, there are others around who are evidently hearing what's going on. All right, so he denies, woman, I know him not. I neither know nor understand what thou sayest. I think Peter said all those things. And let's see where I was. Yeah, okay, so he's there. Then in the second denial, he went out to the porch. Evidently, he's right there inside. And now he goes back, and the cock and the cock crows. Then the second denial begins. The maid saw him and began again to say to them that stood by. Mark's account said, this is one of them. All right, read the parallel. When he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him and said to them that were there, this man also was with Jesus. All right, you had the maid who saw him, who made it. She began to say it again, and then evidently she calls attention to others and those who were close by, and they say, yeah, you were one of them. And then Luke's account says, after a little while, another saw him and said, thou art also one of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. Another would be in addition to this other maid. And that when he says another saw him, likely from the group, the servants and the officers that were standing around. So it's not a contradiction. It's all supplementary or complementary, we might say, to the. Does that make sense to everybody right now? Okay, let's keep going. He again denied. There's a third denial. After a little while, Mark's account says, while again they that stood by said to Peter, of a truth you're one of them, for you're a Galilean. And that's when he began to curse and to swear, I don't know this man of whom you speak. Matthew's account, after a little while, they that stood by, same idea here. When they said, you are a Galilean, Matthew's account says, for your speech betrays you. They could tell he was from Galilee. That's not a contradiction. It's just a supplement to the information. Then he began to curse and to swear, I don't know the man. Luke's account, after the space of about an hour, another confidently affirmed, saying of a truth, this man also was with him, for he's a Galilean. Same thing that Mark's account said. But Peter said, man, I know not what you say. That among the crowd. And then we have a specific about evidently this particular man, one of the servants of the high priest, being a kinsman of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter therefore denied again, and likely, though John doesn't say it, that was when he began to curse and swear. So you put it all together, and it blends perfectly. And so, of course, after that happened, the cock crowed earlier, then the cock crowed a second time, which, the Mark's account says, Peter called to mind the word how that Jesus said, before the cock crowed twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out, and when he thought thereon, he wept. And Matthew's account, he went out and wept bitterly. Luke's account, he went out and wept bitterly. John does not include that part. So they're all supplementary to each other, and it forms a perfect picture of what's going on. You can just see things happen. I tried to kind of boil all that down earlier. I didn't have all of this in the notes, but if you'll notice on page 104 of our booklets, about 2/3 of the way down, I tried to summarize what must have happened And if you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first denial, the maid who keeps the door looks at Peter in the light of the fire. Are you also one of this man's disciples? Others who, underneath that, others who are standing by, art thou also one? Can you imagine? She says it. Yeah, I think I saw you. Aren't you one of them? So it's basically one accusation, but made in the form of several at one time. He moves away from the fire to another part, and the cock crowed. This was still before dawn. The second denial, another maid sees Peter and says, this man also was with Jesus the Nazarene. Now he denies with an oath, I don't know the man. And then at least one male bystander, likely among the chief priest and others, echoes her sentiments and obviously commands, thou art also one of them. And Peter says, man, I am not. And then the third, about another hour passes. And another confidently accuses Peter of a truth. This man also was with him. He's a Galilean. His speech betrays him. That's putting it all together. And one of his servants, the high priest, who was a kinsman, says, didn't I see you in the garden with him? And then he curses and swears, and the cock crows. And then Jesus turns and looks at Peter. He remembers the word of the Lord, and he goes out and he weeps bitterly. Okay, we'll come back to that. All right, we got down on page 105, did we not? Randy, what number did we get on? Was it F? G? Who has that? Janet, you have it? You marked it? I can't ask Patty. She wasn't here Wednesday night. I think we got down to, I didn't mark it either. Let's just start at the top of page 105. Who first asked Peter a question? A maid keeping the door. See, who also entered the accusations against Peter? Others. What did Peter then do, and what happened? He denied that he knew Jesus, and the cock crowed. What happened on the porch or gateway in another part of the court? Another maid did what?
Saw him.
Yeah, saw him and said, you also was with Jesus. And what did he do? He denied with an oath. And I mentioned in the note, the porch was not what we usually think on in our houses, but was an arched passage which led from the street through the front part of the building into the court. As far as we can infer, the palace in Jerusalem, conjointly occupied by Annas and Caiaphas, seems to have been built around a square court and entered by an arched passage or vestibule. And on the farther side of it, probably a short flight up steps, was the hall in which the committee of the Sanhedrin had met. That's from Farr on the Life of Christ. Some have speculated that Peter's frustration over this first embarrassment could have prompted him to leave the premises. I'm just going to move away from these people who are asking me things I don't want to have to talk about. Moving toward the gate, he wonders if someone might find out if he was the one who cut off Malchus' ear. That probably was racing around in the back of his mind. He also could be afraid that at any moment an underling might grab him and make him a prisoner. Whatever the case, the door maids are unwilling to let him out. He goes no farther or further than the entranceway, which via the gate leads to the road. Several are standing around. Likely the other maid who gave Peter entrance into the court told the news about him to the other girl. Having been refused exit, Peter returns to the open courtyard. How much time elapses before this first denial? About what? About an hour. And then according to Matthew 26:73, who identifies Peter as one who was with Jesus, and how do they know? It was others who were what? Standing by. And how did they know? His speech betrayed him. Yes, one of the specific dialects of the Galileans, evidently. Another identifies Peter as a disciple. Who is he? And where did he say he had seen Peter? One of the what? That's right. One of the servants of the high priest. And where did he say he had seen Peter? In the garden. Now that gets really specific. Not only have you been with him? Oh no, I haven't. I think I saw you just earlier tonight in the garden. Well, that gets extremely specific. Could this possibly have thrown more fear into Peter than others' accusation? Yes. Because you could say, well, Peter interfered with the arrest of Jesus. And he did. He interfered with him. He took his sword and did what? Cut off Malchus' ear, which Jesus reattached. J, what did Peter again do following these identifications? He cursed and swore that he didn't know the man. While he yet spoke, what happened? Yes, immediately while he spoke, the cock crowed. Besides the crow of the rooster, what else happened that must have reminded him of Jesus' earlier prediction concerning himself?
Jesus looked at him.
Yes, Jesus looked at him. You just wonder how, evidently maybe a window, or maybe he was on the, we just don't know what the inside of the chamber looked like. But obviously they could see each other. They could see each other's eyes. And I without trying to, just rehash things, I think I've told you before about my granddaddy and how much I appreciated him. And boy, I just remember, I can remember this, and that was 60 years ago, like it was yesterday, that I was playing with the hose and he wanted me to turn it off. I turned it back on, and even from his little lawn chair, just looked at me, and I thought his eyes, he had keen blue eyes, I thought they could just stare right through my skull. And boy, I shut that. He didn't say a word. His look reminded me that he knew that I knew I was being disobedient. He knew that I knew. Think about that. With what all that does, with just a look. You know better. And you know I told you this would happen. And
So Peter loved the Lord, and he knew the Lord loved him too.
yes,
They did love one another.
they did.
And that is crushing as well when this rooster is crowing twice now. And then the Lord looks at him, and then he's like, he said this very thing, and I did exactly what I said I would and what he said I would.
Exactly. Most have made the point, Patty, that after the rooster crowed the first time, that you would think, wake up. What are you thinking? Look at what you're doing. And maybe he's still caught up in everything and he's just not thinking, or not thinking as he should. But then when the third denial and swearing and cursing after he had already said, I'll go to prison, I'll even go to death with you. And here he does it. Yes, sir, Josh.
And that being said, that's a contrast of Peter's fear over Christ's love. He was scared of all this stuff happening, he was going to have, there's going to be consequences for everything, so his responses were out of fear. And Christ, all this going on with him right now, he knows this is it, and he knows what's in store for him. He takes that one moment to look over Peter.
Yeah.
And that look, I was right. And that just proves despite everything going on, he still cared enough about Peter and loved Peter that, and put that moment, emphasize that moment over everything else that was going on.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've got a note on one of the points here that we'll get to in just a second. Peter still, as both of you made the point, Peter still loved the Lord, but his love is counterbalanced, counterweighted with his fear of the people around him. You've got that, here's my love, but I've got this to be worried about. And so as he's worried about this, it's almost like here's my love and here's fear. And then as the fear increases, the love for the Lord goes down. And it's like a scale. And we'll see that he compromised. Compromised even with those around whom he gathered himself. Yes, sir.
When Peter made the statement that I'll go to jail for it, did he not have in his mind Christ is going to be king on earth?
Yeah.
They had to realize he's not talking about earth, he's talking about the heaven.
Yeah.
And so, he goes down and he's saying, this guy's gonna be king. They
how's
have him
he-
in jail.
Yeah, they're talking about death.
Yeah.
How's that gonna happen? Yeah. And again, we can look in hindsight and say, well, Jesus already said he's gonna be, was it Matthew 16:21? After these things, that's after Peter made the good confession, thou art the Christ, there in Caesarea Philippi. After these things, Jesus said, the Son of Man must go into Jerusalem. He must suffer many things of the chief priests and scribes and be crucified and be raised the third day. He said that. But it's like, if you don't understand something, and this is a great truth, that one thing about earlier, but I've thought about this before. If we don't understand how something can happen in the future, like the resurrection, the tendency for people who are rationalists is, if I don't understand it, what? It's not going to happen. And if I can't understand how God created the earth, and it just didn't happen that way. And so if Peter, we see the information, and again, we see it from backwards, from the beginning to the end. And so it's easier for us, but if we lived there with him, I'm not certain if I would have been any better than maybe the apostles were, especially some of them, that, well, how in the world is this going to be? But the fact is, Jesus said, you've got these conflicts in your thinking. How is he going to be raised? How is he going to be the king of the kingdom? What kind of a kingdom is it going to be? Are we going to be kingpins in the kingdom? Secretary of State? Will there be a cabinet? Well, all this. But how can he do that if he's going to die? But then on the other hand, you have Jesus raising people. We have at least 3 occurrences. Who are they? The widow of Nain's son, Jairus' daughter, and then Lazarus. We have those 3 recorded. Might have been others. Those 3 are recorded. Well, if he could raise those 3, and then he says, I'm going to be raised from the dead, you got to think, I'm not sure how it happens, but I believe it does.
Look, it's like, today we say, well, if this happens, I'll not do it.
Yeah.
But we don't know till that happens.
Exactly.
We can't see enough to know how we'd act in a certain situation.
And that's one of my points I've got. You didn't seem to charge me. Never say never. I hope that I would be faithful under circumstances that would be similar to Peter's. I hope. I pray God's help that I would be. But we should never get to the point to where we say, I'd never do that. That's what Peter said. And Peter becomes a prime example for us on all of that. Let's finish up, because I want Lyndon to help me with the song here in just a moment. We want to go through it. Let's see. We answered JKL. Then M, name at least 3 situations or circumstances in which you might deny the Lord. All right, I asked you Wednesday night. Let's think about that. But Charlie, what do you have?
When we were weak, we deny the Lord. I thought about that if our life was surrendered,
Yeah.
we might, just like Peter did. Don't know, I'm like you. I hope I wouldn't.
You're right.
That's a possibility.
Yes. Landon, what about one?
Just to take it just a little bit further on what Charlie said and not get into this morning's sermon too much, some type of physical ailment.
Why is this happening to me?
Why is it happening to me? Or whether it's something like cancer or just old age, and things of that nature.
Yes. I think that's good. Anyone else? Brother Gene, looked like you wanted to say something.
When you get into some kind of social pressure,
Yes.
and the younger you are, the more that affects you.
Yeah. Kirsten, I couldn't help but think about you. As you know, Kirsten is at Sanford. She's in pharmacy school now. And I know, without even having asked her, she's going to have some a lot of people who are in school with her that have taken biology and chemistry who don't believe. You probably already talked to some, haven't you, Kirsten?
If I did, I didn't know.
Yeah, you might have a little advantage being at Sanford.
See, remember where she is.
What's that?
Remember what school that she's
Yeah, I
at.
have to remember it's at Sanford and not maybe Auburn or Alabama, some state school. But oftentimes, as Brother Gene just said, especially in the school environment, when you have professors who have complete control over their sphere, their classroom, and they can say pretty much anything they want to a degree, and belittle people who are of faith, belittle people, and then you sit there, and then some of you may have read the story about the fellow. Does anybody here believe in God? And nobody raised their hand. And, yeah, you can't see God, you can't feel God. Finally, somebody raised their hand and said, "I believe in God." And you can't see Him, you can't all the senses. And he turned it and said, the professor had said, "God does not exist." That's how. And then the student said, "The professor's brain does not exist." Y'all heard that? And then he said, "Well, you can't see it, you can't feel it." You used all the physical senses to describe. We're not sure he has a brain, and that was just the answer to But oftentimes I remember in high school, I had an English teacher, and that was probably the first time I had a conflict, and I wasn't even a Christian. But the teacher kind of land-based people of faith, and actually the teacher in high school where I went, the teacher was in the minority at that time. But she made some statements, and I questioned. Even then, I was about 16. I questioned what she had to say, and I said, "I don't believe that's right." And I was trying to be respectful, but I differed with her publicly in class. And you'll be surprised, nobody said anything. And a little bit afterwards in the hall, 4 or 5 of the kids came up and said, "Philip, I'm glad you said what you did. I believe the same thing you said." They just didn't say anything. And sometimes it takes, go ahead and say what you know is right, and then go from there. I want us to think, oh boy, our time. Turn over to number 83, if you would, in the song book. Number 83, "In the hour of trial, Jesus plead for me. Lest by base denial I depart from thee. When thou seest me waver, with a look recall, nor for fear or favor suffer me to fall." When you see me waver, in other words, I'd like to just almost as it were be in Peter's position and see you looking at me and have that idea, "Oh, you've told me I won't not to. I don't want to betray the Lord. With forbidden pleasures would this vain world charm, or its sordid treasures spread to work me harm. Bring to my remembrance sad Gethsemane, or in deeper semblance, that is, in a form that's even worse than Gethsemane, cross-crowned Calvary. Should thy mercy send me sorrow, toil, or woe, or should pain attend me, or on my path below, grant that I may never fail thy hand to see, but on the other hand, grant that I may ever cast my care on thee. In the hour of trial, Jesus, plead for me. Lest by his denial I depart from thee. When thou seest me waver, when nor for fear or helpful for us to think about what we've been studying with Peter and his denials, and how we can be similarly tempted. And from the information we have, let that be useful to us, profitable, to keep us from sinning along the way. Comment, question before we